I've got some insights to share about the practicalities, maybe in a large scale way, but the practicalities of what are the implications of this for the point that Rick mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. How do you break this enigma in a US context to try to apply some of this to drive change? And I've got some observations about that, some hypotheses to offer. I also would note that the person I've known longest in the room, who I haven't seen in a long time, is Ed Glazer, who, in fact, we shared we were in the same dormitory freshman year back at Princeton, and it's great to see you, Ed. I'm a huge admirer of your work. And in fact, I think your recent book, one of the findings from that, I think, is a huge driver of both the need and the potential platform for urgency in terms of focusing on this in the country, looking across communities. I think if I have this right, you found that the cities with the 1 in 3 people with post-secondary degrees had something like 50% less unemployment than those with 1 in 6. And essentially, at the community level, we're really seeing a stratification of America, not just by students, but by community. And I think that's a powerful, should be a powerful motivator for understanding that we both have a crisis in this country about how we help individual kids succeed, but for people who are in a decentralized system in this country who care about their community, understand that the success of their community in the US is going to depend on how well we apply this evidence and solve those problems. So I'll offer some thoughts about how this gets applied in the U.S. context in a few ways. And again, there are other people with expertise around the room who will, some of this is sort of drawn from, who will have different perspectives, and I know we'll have good discussion about that. The first I'd start with here, a little counterintuitively given what we've heard, but I think there's an asset in the U.S. before I talk about some of the problems that I do want to focus on. Among other things, we have an asset in a significantly growing number of individual schools in the U.S. and clustered in particular states, there's no question, but across the country, that actually have people at the grassroots level in the U.S., teachers, principals, school districts working with those folks, who've had sort of transformative success at the school level overall and achieving results for low-income kids with, I think, really deeply held takeaways that those educators and others have had that fortunately very much match the evidence in some ways about what's being presented today about what countries are doing at large scale. Now, the systems level change to make that possible is obviously a huge leap, but I just want to sort of observe in some of this work I saw in my role running New Leaders for New Schools for a decade, where we had the benefit of 700 leaders that we had selected from 15 times as many applicants, going into schools around the country, had partnerships with some of you in this room, including with Nancy Grasmick in Maryland, is really one of our first state-level partnerships. And while the results are interesting in this, the results mirrored the U.S. in some ways. The New Leaders-led schools made incrementally better progress than the school systems they were in by Rand's account, but not dramatically so. It was about a subset of those schools. We found about 15 or 20% of those schools, which really made transformative improvements based on a variety of outcome measures. So we studied pretty carefully what happened in those schools compared to schools that were making our own schools that we knew well in more incremental gains. Now, these were well-trained leaders, well-selected leaders in about 10 school systems. So we were able to account for kind of in-system variation across systems. And the findings from that will not surprise you, so I'm not here to sort of give you a big ahasness, except to say that there are now growing numbers of educators and those work with educators in this country who understand these points that are being made here in a research-based ways at the system level. Number one, in all these schools we looked at that made bigger improvements, there were really specific high expectations for what kids should know and be able to do by grade level. They were both academic expectations in terms of content. They were often, in fact, how kids ought to think. And they also were around character strengths, really, and kind of what the kind of expectations were for how kids should be and interact with each other. And what I would say is we saw a lot of schools where they said that, but in fact there were certain schools where it was deeply understood by the educators in the school that were very rigorous expectations for all the kids that actually moved things significantly. Secondly, we saw a ever-present focus on a critical mass of leaders at the school level. Not only the principal, but a critical mass principal, an assistant principal, a set of teachers, maybe there's an outside group, but in every one of these cases, there was a group of leaders who were sort of aligned to both a sense of urgency and agency and a shared vision for how to make improvement, specifically in what type of instruction and what type of culture would actually move outcomes for kids toward those high expectations. Third, there was in fact this, and they wouldn't always talk about it this way, but a data-driven focus on continuous improvement. They were constantly getting better based on the best data that they could come up with. And fourth, there was always a focus on teaching, on quality teaching, to attract good teachers and retain good teachers and develop good teachers, and the best, you figure out how to keep the best teachers there, and yes, how to move out teachers who, after they had gotten support, would be moved out one way or the other, which is possible in a unionized setting, at least at the school level, in a reasonably easy way. But hard work, but it's possible. But those sort of themes came from those schools, and yet most of our own new leaders who we had trained with kind of the best in class principal training in the U.S. weren't doing those things. It's in part because of the systemic problems that haven't been solved, which I'll get to in a minute. It's in part because we based our own model, actually, interestingly, which I think we got to be careful of in this discussion at the beginning of new leaders, on what the principals in the best schools were doing, as opposed to what the principals were doing in schools that were in a situation like the schools they were going in and what they needed to do to improve. And so often we misapplied the lessons. In some ways, Andreas referred to this. If you say, what is Finland doing, that may not be as relevant as what a country is, where the U.S. is, or a U.S. state is, to move to the next level. And we misapplied that. One of the things I think we found, again, underscoring one of Andreas' points, is that in the low achieving school, in the highest achieving schools, we found a very collaborative type of leadership where it was really about a lot of people involved in decision making and empowerment of people to move toward. And yet, when we go into the low achieving, low capacity schools, it turned out that there was a fairly, I must say, prescriptive leadership at the beginning around getting people to understand what good instruction looked like and building capacity. And they didn't actually build out, kind of distribute the leadership until the team had been built. And we misapplied that. We actually, at the beginning of New Leaders, tried to actually help the principals do in low achieving schools what principals were already doing in high achieving schools. And we lost several years until we realized that wasn't working. So I think that's an interesting lesson we saw that has application for, well, McKinsey's looked at this from a school system perspective as well, for what Andreas is saying. But the reason I say these things is not because these are necessarily new to most people, and in fact they're not even that different from what you heard, except to say we have a growing number of educators in this country who have experienced this at a school level. So if it's just done right, when the right policy and systems change is being done, this is not new to at least a growing number of folks. The question is how you can leverage those people. So that's an asset we have that I think sometimes is not leveraged enough. So that's kind of one first set of points. Second, and so those are some observations about the school level and how that's an asset base in the U.S. that we can leverage. Secondly, when I look at the, there's some interesting analysis today about kind of the differences among countries and some of the factors that Andreas referred to and Michael and Rick referred to around to some extent, but especially Andreas and Michael around what were some of the explanations for what some of the differences between countries' level of improvement and success. I just want to quickly, this is not from a study of this, but I have been involved in a lot of the U.S. states, U.S. districts, so I've been able to see many of the states that are at the high end of this chart, low end of this chart, and I'll offer a few observations about what I've seen about some common factors among the high-performing states in the U.S. that are in this chart versus the low-performing states that I think are relevant. And then I'm going to sort of finish on how I think what some key factors come out of this and how to sort of break this enigma, as Rick put it. When you look at these states, again, I think that, I don't know which chart it is, but the one that shows the states on this curve. He mentioned the gold medal winner is Maryland. And we're so fortunate to have Nancy Grasmick in the room. It is not a surprise that Nancy Grasmick was the longest serving state superintendent in the entire United States. And I must say, for being the gold winner as a state in the U.S., you're here. I do really want to give an extra hand of applause to Nancy for your leadership. So you'll also correct me what I say wrong on this, given what you sort of presided over in Maryland, Nancy. But what I would say is, in fact, that the states at the high end of that curve, both in terms of improvement, are states that had a sustained focus on statewide change, reflecting some of many of the core principles that were articulated here. But there were leadership, often a state superintendent, usually not just, sort of often a statewide civic group. Terry Peterson sort of was very involved in this in South Carolina as a model and talks about this. Often a few set of elected officials, but there's kind of a critical mass of leaders who stayed with this year after year, decade after decade, doing the kinds of things that were discussed in the report, although now we're taking them to new levels. And I must say that when you look at, really with almost without exception, when you look at Massachusetts, that was certainly true, and David Driscoll is an enormously central part of that. Maryland, that was true. Florida, that was true. This is not a partisan. You got Democrats, Republicans. Jeb Bush in Florida was a very significant part of that. Delaware, interesting. Delaware had a civic group that was really, in some ways, the large leader in Delaware that's sort of driven that across time. New Jersey's an interesting one that doesn't get often talked about, and I think New Jersey's an interesting one to go more into, to look at what happened in New Jersey. But that sustained, focused leadership at the state level is just a key differentiator, literally among every one of these states that have made the biggest improvements. And so I'll come back to that, but that's one observation I would make to you about that. A second observation in terms of the state level work is that, you know what, in the interest of time, we're just going to go to to underscore the importance of something that was raised before, which is the presence of the fact that more of the low performing states made more progress in the US, which was true, I think, in the domestic data, wasn't true in the global data. And I think that's an interesting thing to come back to in a minute. Well, why is that? Why would the low achieving states here be making mostly more progress than the high achieving states, even though that's not true globally? It doesn't have to be the case. Massachusetts demonstrates, Maryland demonstrates that's not the case. It's two high-performing states, relatively speaking, that made improvements. So you show it can be done, but for the most part, I think that's a really crucial fact to look at about why that's true. And so then, okay, then let me just move into, with some of those observations, what are the keys to breaking the policy enigma that Rick talked about? And I had my notes from that. He, I think, had he talked about you recognize the value of education, recognize the need for improvement, set challenging goals, and then failure, I think was his account of that. So I would offer a few key points about why that's true, and I think how we have to break out of this, that augment the substantive work you've heard. I agree. I mean, what Michael and Andrea shared about what's been learned, I think, is just spot on in terms of system reform. Michael Fullen has just done so much crucial work that goes into this very deeply about what's needed. And I would say, okay, we don't have time. I'm not going to spend more time on those substantively, except to say I think those are the right things. But they haven't taken hold. So why haven't they taken hold, and what can make them take hold in the US at scale in a way that we've only been able to do at the school level or in a few individual states so far? Number one is I think we haven't focused squarely on the right unit level of change in the US. And I say that as somebody who I'm a big supporter. I believe President Obama has been courageous and engaged on education, worked for President Clinton. I think he was too. President Bush was a very focused. We've had presidents actually who've been very focused on education in significant ways. And I think that's probably been a largely pretty good thing. But that's not the unit of change here, as we know. We have a decentralized system. We have 15,000 school districts. We have 50 states. And when you do the things that Rick described about setting goals, but not actually at the unit of change that actually can do something about it, it doesn't lead to much. You set goals for, if we set goals for what those of us in this room would do over the next 3 years together and then left, nothing much would happen. We don't really have a system here. I mean, Michael Fullen's point about whole systems reform, I think is just the absolute key here. The federal government is not a system. I think the federal government has a very important role to play. And if I don't have time in my comments, we have time in a panel discussion, I can talk about my views about the crucial role the federal government has to play. I think President Obama is really right on this at a high level of incenting work at the state and local level, maintaining federal funding to focus on equity, given the share of federal funding that goes to low achieving schools, trying to advance and incent and support a couple key things like the Common Core, which are state-led but with federal incentives. I think that those are just the right balance, but those are not going to solve the problems. Those are just going to help create better conditions to solve the problems. The unit of change here, I think fundamentally, I think in the end is actually the real unit of change is at the school level, but only made possible by large-scale systems that create the conditions to support that. Now, many of you know this, and I'm presuming to say this in front of some of you is sort of like, of course we know that. But in fact, practically, we haven't as a country looked at how do we actually focus on the state and district and city role that Ed alluded to at the beginning of this discussion, actually is the catalytic force for driving whole systems reform. Those have largely been, with some just tremendous exceptions, David Driscoll and Nancy Grasmick being in a small number of those, they've been a few bright spots among a sea of kind of mediocrity and absence of focus. We actually haven't really looked in the US overall at what kind of leadership we need there, what kind of systems change we need there, and then we act as if at the national level that those goals or policies will make change when they're just preconditions. So I think for an individual state, the lessons of this are much easier. I think for an engaged leader, a set of leaders coming to a state, I think some very clear lessons from this research that's been described about what can be done. I think a conundrum and a dilemma is, what do you do in a decentralized system that can actually help us as a country move forward, knowing that we've actually got to get a whole lot of states and cities to do that? And so I think while these lessons are fantastic for the right leaders in some bright spot states and cities, what we do about that as a national issue in a federalist system, I think is a very significant challenge. And I must say, I don't have answers to that. I'm really interested in Germany as an interesting example, which is probably the country that's actually both the biggest country that's the highest performing, that's sort of somewhat got some similarities in what the improvements have been there. I think there would be probably some insights. I think that's a dilemma for us that we haven't spent enough time on in education. Secondly, in terms of my what it'll take to apply this, I think this data that you heard today underscores this. I think that a lack of understanding in our country about where we are in our particular communities and states against where we need to be for our kids to be successful and that lack of urgency that comes out from that is a huge problem. Now, some people might hear that and say, well, how is that true? An NBC poll came out this week, some of you may have seen, that actually Americans named the quality of public schools as the #1 threat to America's future. That was more Americans said that was our biggest threat than literally anything else. And see how well isn't that urgency? Or you could cite other data showing that 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis and given very bad grades. And doesn't that show we know we got a real problem? I think there's a lot of windows into this, but one piece of data that I think underscores this is 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis, and some of you know this. But 80% of parents think that their local schools are doing fine in the U.S. And generally, I think people, including, I mean, that percentage aren't quite as high among parents in low-achieving schools. It's not 80, but it actually is still around 60%. That for the most part, people think the crisis they hear about are in someone else's school, in someone else's community and state. So when data comes out, like the data that's come out from some terrific reports that you put out, Rick, and that Andres puts out, and OECD puts out, people generally, oh, yeah, there is that problem that those people have, and what are they going to do about that? And nothing changes. And I think that addressing that is a second dilemma. How do we actually establish that sense of urgency? I think at the state level, again, I think if you look at some states that have done this, well, there's clearly been effort at the state level with great leadership to be able to do that, but nationally, we haven't had that. I think one promising thing I would flag here, and this is just the beginning of some work on this, is how to make that data available to leaders in a much more localized way. Andreas OECD has been driving this. The Kern Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies have been supporting it. We've been helping America achieve. Is this project to have 100 U.S. high schools this spring took a school-level version of the PISA, or an examination against the PISA frameworks, where the schools will be getting results back later this year, where they can look at how their individual schools did, urban, suburban, rural, low-income, moderate-income, higher-income schools against the rest of the world. And I think the reason they stepped forward is they want to know, how are we doing against the best of the world? And I think that this is a pilot, but I think it's got real promise, because I think that the OECD is interested if this goes well in expanding. I think the Common Core has a lot of benefits, but I think embedding the kind of ability to look at how schools do compared to the rest of the globe is another chance to do this. But I think we can make that data more localized. That's not the only thing that's needed. Again, obviously we need the leadership at the local and state level. We need the content that's been described. But I think that with the right effort to make sure that that's really readily available could really help. And then the third thing I would say, if we've got to solve for this dilemma of how to get a bunch of states and cities working on this in a federalist system. Second is, how do we establish urgency when people have urgency about the country's crisis but don't about their own? The third and last one I just think is a leadership issue, especially a pipeline and support for leadership at the local and state level. So how do we have many more David Driscolls, Nancy Grasmicks, some of the superintendents, some of the civic leaders and organizations? That's not in this country going to be a federal government-driven effort. Largely, I think that the federal government, the bully pulpit focusing on it, a president focusing on it, makes education more attractive. I think that is one of the central challenges that face, I think, the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector, and civic groups, and how does that leadership pipeline get created and supported that can actually apply these lessons. So I think that I will only make one last other note that I just see as a dilemma that I think Michael mentioned, or Andreas briefly mentioned as well. I think this question of what outcomes we are focused on is really crucial, not only to drive the substantive work, but in order to actually have our educators in our country engaged in this work. I think the Common Core represents an enormous opportunity to have assessments that are based on, that are on much more rigorous standards, that are much more focused standards, that are better than most of the state standards in terms of preparing kids for college and careers. And I think that's a step in the right direction. But even beyond better academic assessments, I think we need to have educators and families and students motivated by their sense of achieving goals that are going to matter for the long haul. I think the issue of looking at some things like collaborative problem solving is an interesting part of that. I think looking at things like character strengths, I'm not saying that these can be in globalized comparable assessments, but nonetheless character strengths of the kind of like persistence and grit and engagement, the kind of things that actually drive success is important. And I think our being able to focus in schools and communities on a set of goals, including academic outcomes, college enrollment, college completion, certainly another example, I think is not only substantively going to matter, but I actually think that if we can't mobilize in this country the level of engagement we need without people understanding how a set of goals is something they're working toward that actually will matter to their long-term future in a way that's more, that's broader than only the important focus on better academic results. So with that, I'll finish and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jon.